darkest nights, you are close like no other. I've known you as a father, I've known you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. Yes, all my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God.
I tell people all the time that we are incredibly blessed here at Grace with our worship ministry. And so thank you, Ptasix. Thank you, Lynn and Skip and Joe, for the goodness you all bring each and every week. It's not just something I say to pass the time from me getting up here to you leaving. It really mean it. You guys are amazing and wonderful. I do know some preachers that do that. So welcome. So glad that you're here this morning, both in person and if you're joining us online. We're just so glad for you to be in worship this morning. My name is Stephen Ingram. I'm the pastor of students, missions, and adult formation. And I consider it a real honor and privilege to be able to be up here and take you through our second week of the book of Judges. We decided that we're going to spend July in the book of Judges. And Tyler started us off last week looking at the kind of infrastructure of the book of Judges. Now, the first thing, and he said this last week, but just as a reminder, the first thing we got to realize is that the book of Judges is not about judges as we generally think about them, right? This is not a book that's about a courtroom scene with a jury and plaintiff and verdicts being handed out. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about Judges. You see, Judges, the book of Judges is set up after Joshua, which is the sixth book of the Bible. So you got the Pentateuch, right? And then you have Joshua, and then you have Judges. And what's happening here is the Israeli children, the children of Israel, right? The Hebrew people have come out of Egypt, right? They have come out of slavery. They've come out of the rule of Pharaoh. And then they spend a time wandering in the wilderness, finding out who they are, figuring out who they're going to be. And then they move into a period of conquest, which is really what we see in a lot of in the book of Joshua. And that is a period of them finding their land, finding not only who they're going to be, but where they're going to be. And then when we pick up with the book of Judges, there's still conquest, there's still war going on, but really now they're struggling as a people with identity. They're figuring out how they're going to how they're going to live in this land and who they're going to be. And this is a time before the kings, okay? This is the time before there's like a president or a king or a supreme ruler, right? And so what happens during this period is these judges, okay, kind of rise to the occasion, and they become sort of temporary leaders in this newly formed nation, this newly formed people. Most of them are leaders in a militaristic sense, and so you kind of have to understand that the book of Judges is a very bloody book. It's a book full of conflict and war, and you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, I've never heard a sermon out of Judges. There's a reason why, okay? It's a thick, tough book to really spend some time in. And this morning, we're going to be spending time in Judges 11, and this is the story of a fellow named Jephthah, okay? Again, this might be something very completely new to you. I talked to several people after the first services, and they said they had literally never heard the name Jephthah before. So this morning, we'll be talking about Jephthah. And so I'm going to encourage you, if you have a Bible, go ahead and flip over to Judges 11. And if not, feel free to follow along on the screen as we read. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the first 10 verses, stop for a moment, do a little synopsis of the next part, and then we'll read the final part of that chapter, which are verses 29 through 40. So stick with me. There's a lot of names. There will be some mispronunciations, so here we go. Judges 11. Now Jephthah, the Gileadite, son of a prostitute, was a mighty warrior. Gilead was the father of Jephthah. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah away, saying to him, "You shall not inherit anything in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Outlaws collected around Jephthah and went raiding with him. After a time, the Ammonites made war against Israel. And when the Ammonites made war against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to bring Jephthah from the land of Tob. And they said to Jephthah, "Come be our commander, so that we may fight against the Ammonites." But Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "Are you not the very ones who rejected me and drove me out of my father's house? So why do you come to me now when you're in trouble?" The elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "Nevertheless, we have now turned back to you, so that you may go with us and fight with the Ammonites and become the head over us, over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, "If you bring me home to fight with the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, then I'll be your head." And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, "The Lord will be witness between us. We will surely do as you say." So at this point in the story, we're reading about this character named Jephthah. We're introduced to him, and the very first thing that we're told about Jephthah is he's the son of a prostitute. Already the story is interesting, right? And so then his dad has some more children with his wife. Those children grew up and say, "Hey, you know what? You're not really one of us," and they push him out. They push him out to another land. They push him out not only out of his home, they push him out of his community, his village. They also push him out of his inheritance. And so very early on, Jephthah already has a pretty tragic story. A story that is not of his own doing. He didn't ask to be born out of that marriage covenant. He didn't ask to be born to a prostitute, which is going to scar him and stain him in that culture for the rest of his life. He didn't ask for any of that, and he gets pushed out. Well, he's out now, and he is in a land that is foreign to him, and eventually he begins to make a way for himself. And really the way to understand it is Jephthah became known as sort of a mercenary, and he had a band of mercenaries with him, and they began to be known for sort of their military might. They began to be known for their military prowess, and they were a force to be reckoned with. Well, all of a sudden, home starts calling. The elders of Gilead call him and say, "Jephthah, we need your help." Now, at this point, Jephthah has all the chips on his side of the table, right? He has all the leverage because not only have they wronged him, but now they need him. So they call him back and they say, "Listen, we need you. We want to fight against the Ammonites. They're your enemy. They're our enemy. we need you. And Jephthah looks at him and says, look, you kicked me out. You abandoned me. You pushed me to the outskirts. Why in the world would I come back and help you? And they look at him and they say, look, if you come back and help us, we'll make you our leader. We'll pay for our sins and we'll make you our leader. All of a sudden, the stakes are very, very high for Jephthah. Jephthah accepts, and then the next set of verses, here's basically what happens. Jephthah does not jump into a military conflict with the Ammonites. He actually does, takes quite a few different diplomatic channels to try to resolve this potential war without fighting. He talks to the leaders about, you said we passed through your land when we weren't supposed to, but here's the actual route we took, and this land has actually been our land, and that's your land. And so he really tries to do a lot of diplomatic maneuvering in order to avoid war. Well, alas, the diplomatic efforts didn't work. The king of the Ammonites did not return his letter, and he had exhausted sort of his diplomatic channels. And so war was upon them. And that's where we pick up in verse 29. So this is still Judges 11, verse 29. It says, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Now, hear that. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. He passed on the Mitzvah of Gilead, and from Mitzvah of Gilead, he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and he said this, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Ammonites, that shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites and fought against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. He inflicted a massive defeat on them from Aor to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 towns, and as far as, and I can't pronounce this, Alibalek-Okaram, whatever. We're just going to go with that, okay? I've tried like 20 times this week. It's not going to work, all right? So the Ammonites, you just got to admit defeat sometimes, right? So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mitzvah, and there was his daughter, coming out to meet him with timbrels and with dancing. She was his only child. He had no son or daughter except her. When he saw her, he tore his clothes, and he said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord and cannot take back my vow. She said to him, my father, if you've opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has given you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites. And she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Grant me 2 months so that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my companions and I. Go, he said, and he sent her away for 2 months. So she departed, and she and her companions bewailed her virginity on the mountains. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow that he had made. She had never slept with a man. So there arose an Israelite custom that for 4 days every year the daughters of Israel would go out to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Feels weird to say the word of God for the people of God after that, right? It's a weird story. It feels more like a story out of Game of Thrones than out of the Bible. You know, it's when you first read this story, I don't know if you're like me, you're thinking, what in the world is the relevance of this? How in the world is this applicable to me? And it's probably not unless you were sitting around on a Saturday morning reading the book of Leviticus and thinking, I might go do a child sacrifice today. Head over to Lowe's and, get some retaining wall stones, build a little altar, get some of the Instafire wood, and, little Timmy, I've got several kids. That's not the way we think, right? That's not the world we live in. And so on the outset, this story feels completely irrelevant. It feels so outside of our kind of modern mindset and our modern confines. That is until we take a deeper dive into not only the story, but sort of the psyche and what's going on with Jephthah. Now remember, Jephthah had a hard past, right? I mean, he had been pushed out, he had been rejected, he had been left by his own people on the outskirts for dead. And now he had his chance. He was being brought back into the fold. He had his chance to shine. And not only to shine, but to achieve a level that may have not even been possible before. He had a lot to prove. Now, one of the things that we have to take a quick dive into as we go through his story is this idea of sacrifice or burnt offering. The text actually uses the term, I will make to you a burnt offering, okay? And this is important because this is not something that we talk about in our normal, everyday, 21st century modern American life, right? We don't talk about burnt offerings or sacrifice. And so a couple of things to remember is, one, to talk about burnt offerings or sacrifice is not going to be unusual in that time and place in the world, okay? This was a normal custom. The Jews were coming out of Egypt, which burnt offerings and sacrifices would have been a very normal part of who they were and what they did. Other religions in the area also had burnt offerings and sacrifices, and so did the Jews at this point. One thing that is important, though, to note is that these burnt offerings and sacrifices, at least for the Israelites, were not people. Okay, this was not a human, they didn't do human sacrifices and burnt offerings at this time. Okay, there's evidence at different parts in their history that they did, but at this point, this is not something that would have been common. It would have been animals, or it would have been some kind of form of grain or crop. So much so that Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, says this about human sacrifice in the Jews. He said, it was not only not practiced, but understood to be against the will of God. So kind of keep that in mind as we're thinking about burnt offerings and sacrifice. The other thing that's important to note about the language, about going into the Hebrew here, is when Jephthah makes his vow, the Hebrew is a little ambiguous in terms of what he's saying he's vowing to sacrifice. The Hebrew doesn't actually say, whoever comes out of my house. It doesn't actually even say, whatever comes out of my house. It's just the thing that comes from my house, okay? The first thing that comes from my house. So it's not connotating a human sacrifice. It's not necessarily connotating an animal, or definitely not a plant sacrifice, since that's a crop sacrifice, since that's not going to be coming out of his house, okay? So again, a few important things to remember. But here's the problem in the story. Okay, this is where the story, the crux of the story, takes a negative turn. Up until this point, Jephthah's a hero. Jephthah is someone that we can get behind. Jephthah is a rags to riches story. He's the guy that got kicked out and came back, and it's like a Count of Monte Cristo kind of story. Until he makes this vow. Here's the problem with the vow. Anytime you read in biblical literature this phrase, and he was led by the Spirit, that should pop a flag up in your mind, and it should make you pay attention, because what that generally means in biblical literature is this. Anytime it says that God went before them, or that they were led by the Spirit, here's what that means. That God was going before them to make the path straight, to make it wide, to clear the path, and do whatever needed to be done. The recipient of who God was going before them, or who was being led by the Spirit, their job in that situation was to be faithful and to follow God. Okay, that's incredibly important in this story, because it said the Spirit led him. The Spirit went before him. In that world, that meant that God had already taken care of the battle with the Ammonites. This was a done deal. But you got to remember the mindset of Jephthah. Everything was on the line. Getting to go home again. Getting to be a part of his family. Getting to assume this prestigious role as the leader of his people. Everything was on the line for Jephthah. And in Jephthah's mindset, I guarantee you he was thinking, I'm not gonna leave this to chance. I'm not gonna leave this to chance. I'm not gonna let something accidentally happen and this not work out for me. I've waited too long, I've come too far, we've gotta seal the deal on this one. And so he makes a little bit of a transactional, propositional statement with God. God, if you do this, even though you've already said you're gonna do this, if you do this, I wanna seal the deal by promising you that I will sacrifice whatever comes out of my house, the first thing that comes out of my house, as soon as I come home. He was led by the Spirit, and all he was called to do was to be faithful and to follow. Jephthah lost the plot line. He lost the narrative. Another way to put it, Phyllis Tribble, who's a renowned biblical scholar, says in her book, Texts of Terror, she says, Jephthah's vow of sacrifice was both an act of unfaithfulness and disbelief. When judged by history, Jephthah's act of holiness was actually an act of unfaithful injustice. All he was called to do was to follow and be faithful. And instead of trusting God, he wanted to secure his future. He wanted to make sure that things would go the way that he wanted them to go. He made this unholy vow. He made this unholy sacrifice because he didn't trust God. I would argue that Jephthah is not the only one who makes these unholy vows, that the church, that we have made unholy vow after unholy vow after unholy vow all through the history of our faith. It doesn't take too much wandering to find so many of these travesties in our history. It doesn't take a long look to remember the Inquisitions and how the church supported those, how the church funded those, both with money and with law. We don't have to look far to remember the witch trials and the persecuted minorities in those, to remember the gas chambers and the ovens of Nazi Germany, and how the church was central, how the church brought texts from John to justify the killing of the Jews because the Jews killed Jesus. We don't have to look far back in our own history to see the slavery in the South, the segregationists standing with Bibles in their hands, quoting scripture to show how we were made to be apart, how some were created less and others were created more. Even in our own denomination, we can look at our histories of racism and sexism. We do not have to look far to see these travesties that occur because we make these unholy vows out of piety, out of believing that this is what we should do, and backing it up with scripture. In Adam Hamilton's book, When Christians Get It Wrong, Adam Hamilton wrote this book, about 7-8 years ago. And he, if you don't know Adam Hamilton, he's the pastor of Church of the Resurrection, United Methodist, largest church in America. It's out in Leawood, Kansas, out in Kansas City. And Adam Hamilton decided to write this book, When Christians Get It Wrong. And he wrote it based on the answers of a survey that was done a few years before. And this survey was a really simple survey, but it had incredibly profound ramifications for how we understand ourselves and our place in culture. The survey was done with a very specific group of people, and the group of people were 16 to 30-year-olds who were not currently involved in religion or the church, okay? 16 to 30-year-olds who were not currently involved in the church. It was a really simple study. It was a word association study where they gave them a word and they said, now give us your instant reaction, your instant word association with the words that we give you. And one of the words that they gave them was the word Christian. Here are the results of that survey. When given the word Christian, the number one answer that 91% of those 16 to 30-year-olds who were not involved in the church, the number one answer they gave was anti-homosexual. 91% of them said that's the very first word they think of when they think of the word Christian. The second word association at 87%, judgmental. The third word at 85% is hypocritical. Now here's what we have to remember. This is not a list of all the negative words that people gave. This is a list of the very first words that people gave when they were given the word Christian. These are their first reaction. Anti-homosexual, anti-LGBTQ, judgmental, and hypocritical. We have a choice. This is our fork in the road. We can double down and say, well, they obviously weren't in church for a reason. They were already biased. Or, well, they hadn't lived enough life. They're only 16 to 30. They haven't lived enough life to really know what it's about. They'll come around when they have kids. We can double down and justify those answers a million different ways, and we will go the road of Jephthah every time. We will take unholy vows, and we will harm those around us. Or we could choose a different path, and we can let things like that survey be prophetic, not only in our lives personally, but in the lives of the church. And let them hold up a mirror to us and say, okay, what is this world seeing inside of these walls, inside of this heart? What does that world see that we don't? And what can that tell us about ourselves and the unholy vows that we have taken time and time again as a church? It's easy to look back at history. It's easy to look at the witch trials in Nazi Germany. It's easy to look at segregation. It's easy to look at the Inquisition and say, that's horrible. That doesn't make any sense. Of course that's against God. That's because hindsight's 20/20. What takes the deeper knowledge of ourselves, what takes deeper character, is to be able to look in real time and say, okay, what are those things that our grandchildren will judge us for? What are those things that we're doing that will be judged by history? And that history will look back on us and say, how in the world could they have done that? How in the world could they have acted that way and believed that they were on the side of God? So the title of this sermon is A Dummies Guide to Not Sacrificing Your Daughter, all right? So we're coming full circle to that now, all right? So I'm gonna give you 3 rules. I'm gonna give you your Dummies Guide to not sacrificing your children. Now, if your children are getting especially on your nerves this morning, you might wanna close your ears, okay? But this is the Dummies Guide to not sacrificing your daughter. Rule number 1, remember our roles. Remember the roles. And here's what I mean by that. God is the judge, we are not. Jephthah's first mess up was he forgot the role. God had already said, I've gone ahead, I'm taking care of this. Jephthah's role was to be faithful and follow. God said, I will take care of this, you just follow. The Spirit led him up, the Spirit went before him. So the first rule that we have to remember is to remember the roles, that God is the judge and we are not. Matthew 7, 1-3, and this is Sermon on the Mount, so this is really prime Jesus material here. It says this, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will also be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own? As clear as Jesus can be, I think he's clear about judgment. It's not our job, it's not our role. God is known as the judge, we are not. That is not what we have called to be. That's not what we've been equipped to be. Rule number 1 is to remember our role. Rule number 2, remember the greatest commandments. Matthew chapter 22, verses 37-40. Here's what Jesus said. Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is equal to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all of the law and the prophets. And I want you to focus on 2 things in that verse. The first one is, Jesus said, the first commandment is love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is equal to it. And that equal mark is really important. The second is equal to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. I hear Jesus saying, look, you can't do one without the other. One doesn't make sense unless you do the other. And that's both sides of the coin. You can't love God if you don't love your neighbor. You can't love your neighbor unless you know how to love God. Jesus is telling us very clearly that if you can't do those things, all the other rules, all the other laws, all the other commandments, they're not going to work out for you. Because and this is the second part you have to listen to, all of the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. You see, in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, there is a hierarchy of commandment. Now, we don't often talk about that. We try to act like all the rules are the same, but they're not. Jesus makes it clear here. All the law and all the prophets hang on these two things. If you don't get these two things right, the rest of it's not going to work. There is a hierarchy of love in the New Testament, especially in the words of Jesus. It's always going to go back to how do we love God and how do we love neighbor. That's a lens that we have to see the entire world through. And if we're following the law, but it's not loving our neighbor, then we're doing it wrong. If we're following the law, if we're following the rules, but it's not loving God, then we're doing it wrong. We have to filter everything through this idea of loving God and loving neighbor. John 13:35, Jesus says, "They will know that you are my followers because of how you love." In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, the three that remain are faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these are love. Greater has no one than this who lay down their life for their friends. It's John 15. You see, the problem a lot of times is we get mixed up. We want to focus on our understanding of God's holiness, and we leave behind a biblical understanding of God's grace. Hear that, okay? We get so focused on holiness, on piety, on being right, that we completely forget this idea of biblical grace. This idea that nothing we can do is going to bring us any closer or any farther away from God. And nothing that anyone else can do is going to make them any less of a child of God. We focus on our understanding of God's holiness without a biblical understanding of God's grace. And then our third and final rule is this: trust God. You have nothing to prove. See, the core of Jephthah's sin was an overcompensation for his own fear. It was an overcompensation for his own fear and a lack of trust in God. If he would have just trusted, if he would have just been led by the Spirit and trusted God to be God and me to be me, we wouldn't be talking about Jephthah as one of the greatest fools of the Old Testament. We'd be talking about him as a father of faith. We'd be talking about him as one of the great leaders of Israel. But he chose to lean on his own understanding instead of the path that God had laid out for him. I can imagine Jephthah being about to go on to the front lines of battle and his army surrounding him and his leaders close to him. And I can imagine him saying, God, if you give us this battle against the Ammonites, God, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. And the leaders begin to talk and to whisper, this is a man of great faith. This is a man who must be so committed to God. Listen to our leader. Listen to him commit. There's no way I could ever commit to the things that he's committing to God. This man must be so close to God's own heart. He must be so dedicated to his faith. You see, in the moment, it is easy to lift up zealots. But a long view almost always shows us how destructive they really are. One last word in the story I want us to pay attention to. And when we read it, it may have caught you. It may have caught you. It might have perked a little interest in you. Go back to verse 36 and 37. It says this. This is Jephthah's daughter talking. She said to him, my father, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has given you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites. And she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Grant me 2 months so that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my companions and I. Some translations say bewail, some translations say bemoan my virginity. This has nothing to do with sex, okay? This has nothing to do with a wedding night promise, okay? This has to do with her future. This has to do with her children, her grandchildren. This has to do with a life lost, but lives that will never materialize because of this act. This has to do with Jephthah's daughter's future, her life, her love, her laughter, the things that she had envisioned in her mind that she would do. She is bemoaning the days that will never happen, the life that will never happen, the children that will never come. And every bit of it, not a single part of it, was because of anything she had done. You see, in losing the plot line, Jephthah not only destroyed his daughter's life, he destroyed his own life as well. See, the story tells us that Jephthah's daughter was his only daughter. It was his only child. That's it. In doing this, Jephthah not only destroyed her life, he destroyed his lineage. He destroyed any hope of a future for himself as well. And I promise you, the church has continued to do the same thing. We sacrifice our sons and daughters on these unholy altars by taking these unholy vows of piety and pushing them out to the outskirts, harming them, because we value an idea of God's holiness more so than God's grace. We destroy our own future. If you notice, we never get a name for Jephthah's daughter. We just call her Jephthah's daughter. She's never given a name in the entire text. She's nameless. How many nameless sacrifices has the church undertaken in the name of piety and holiness and religion? How many children of God has the church sacrificed for our need to prove that we're worthy, overcompensating for our own fears? How many futures have been sacrificed on these unfaithful altars of fear and justice? My prayer for you is this. I pray that we will remember our roles, that we will let everything, our belief and our action, hinge on the greatest commandments, and that we will remember that we have nothing to prove. And all we have to do is simply trust and follow the path that God is laying out for us.
Thanks again for being here with us for worship. We're glad that you joined us for S3. If you'd like to know more about the church, discipleship opportunities, or ways that you can serve, be sure to click on one of the links below. Also, if you're interested in supporting the church beyond your prayers and your presence, we hope that you'll consider giving financially as well, and you can find that link on our page as well. Thank you for being here. Have a great week.